Okay, so I think it's important to take a look at this political parties in the United States timeline. I've posted this into Google Classroom and you can take a look at it on your own. But I thought you need a little bit of an overview of this entire thing. So I'm going to walk you through what I think are the most important parts of this. So you'll notice that there are like these lines and everything going across here. So what these lines really represent are the political parties, and from the point of view of presidential politics at the time. So when you see this, you're going to see that there's these colors that represent different things. Your textbook, I think, has this very simple explanation, this graphic that's really overly simplified, and I think this maybe goes too far in the other direction. I've seen even more complex posters than this that kind of describe what's going on. But I think that the big takeaway I want you to get from this is that there are six times within American history where the meaning of the political parties have shifted. And you could see those shifts here, 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 and here, and here. And what they do nicely is they kind of describe um, what actually is the first, like what actually is happening here. So if you like zoom in a little bit, it'll show you the first party system. And it says that it was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And they give you an overview of the history of the moment. And then they kind of put together, even if there was no party platform at the time, they put together an actual platform, like things that they either side believed in. And they also tell you how long it lasted. So this one lasted from 1792 to 1820. And then when you scroll up, you'll see from the point of view of presidential politics, that those colors get represented here. So they kind of match the colors down there. Um, if there's a circle around, like for instance, for Thomas Jefferson, it means that there's a dot and there's a circle around it. That means that that person won the presidency. And then they have these little call outs here that kind of give you some historical things that were happening at that particular moment that may have impacted party politics. So the big takeaway in the very beginning in this part is to take a look and see, like, well, what happened to the political parties by 1820? Well, there seemed to be no real Federalist Party anymore. It had died out in terms of presidential politics. It had lasted within the Supreme Court for a very long time with John Marshall. But in terms of presidential politics and national politics, there really was no Federalist Party anymore. And we call it the era of good feelings, where there was no one political party. Then things kind of splinter out over here. Um, And the big debate now seems to be girding for the issue of slavery, but hasn't totally yet divided. So the Democratic Republicans that are represented in green kind of morphed into what eventually becomes the Democratic Party, but its meaning will be a little bit different than Jefferson's version of it. And the same thing happens here. Federalist Party kind of dies out, and there really is no forerunner of the Federalist Party. Kind of totally dies out. And then you get the National Republican Party, um, and then we get into the issues of slavery right around here. Free soil being like people who believe that there should be part of the country that is, you know, anti-slavery. Then we get this Know Nothing Party. These are like third parties that kind of are offshoots that eventually get morphed into the Republican Party. The Know Nothing Party was anti-immigrant party that this chart is saying is like sort of some people left, fled that, and eventually become what is the Republican Party. And that's basically how you're going to follow this. Um, the second party system is from 1828 to 1854, and they explain that now it's the Democratic Party, and the Whig Party. And then like the names as we know it, like just the name of the party, but not necessarily the ideas behind them, start with a third party system just before the Civil War. So that's where we get the Democratic and Republican parties that we kind of understand from today. But they have shifted their meaning three times since that, like that has taken place. once once after an 1896 election, once after the 1932 election, and then once after the 1968 election. So political parties, as we know them, have shifted major times. I'm going to kind of go over just the party systems and like what actually is the difference between these parties politically in each of the different party systems, and not go over it in detail, but just kind of give you a broad overview of what's going on. I think this will help you kind of understand all of American history if you kind of look at this chart. Politically, I think it will describe lots of things that are going on in the country. So that's kind of why I'm thinking to take this time here. So the first party system we've been talking about, and it's really about this definition of, what is the role of the government? In terms of, where does it protect things constitutionally? And then also the major issues are over the fact that there is this dispute in terms of foreign policy, and then also regionally, somewhat regionally based, or like there's groups of people. So the Federalists are like supporters of the Constitution, strong central government, suspicious of the idea of like too many people being directly in charge of things. So they're opposed actually to a lot of ideas of democracy, and they're trying to create systems that would prevent that. Like one example of that would be the fact that people who sit on the Supreme Court sit for life, where people in the Senate serve for 6 years. So the longer terms, the more power that has been given to the central government is reflected in the Federalist point of view in the Constitution. They supported England over France, and they became more interested in like more in urban areas, business areas, upper class, the bankers, and strongest in the coastal areas of the United States and New England in particular. The Democratic Republicans are more strict constructionists when it comes to the Constitution. They believe you can only do those things that are specifically there. Federalists believe that it's a living Constitution. It can change its meaning over time. They argue for less power into the central government and more power for states' rights. Supported France as opposed to England. More farmers as opposed to being more urban. And they were strongest in the South and the West. So regionally, very different. But then something happens in the 1820s where the Federalist Party kind of basically dies out and is no longer around. And then we get this second party system. And I won't go through each of the major differences here, but because I think you can take a look at that on your own. But the second party system basically is emerging from a split from the Democratic Republican Party. There were two main factions of that party, that held by Andrew Jackson, who was a supporter of the war, the hero of the War of 1812 and the Indian Wars, and Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So Jackson's followers formed the Democratic Party, while Clay's formed the Whig Party. Although the parties were fairly evenly divided in the Congress, the Whigs elected two presidents, both of whom died in office. Democrats gradually came to support Whig policies. So the Democratic Party and the Whig Party kind of eventually morphed. So the Whig policies that were in particular typically different, such as industrialization, railroads, and the issue of slavery and the expansion to the Western territories finally split the Whigs in the 1850s. So slavery takes the Whigs party and kind of creates Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Democratic Party being the party that supported the institution of slavery, and the Republican Party, which was the forebearer of the leader of that party eventually really is Lincoln, the model of Lincoln here. So the issue of slavery dividing the country split the Democratic Party into more like the Democrats were in the North, in the South, and the Republicans were more in the North. So that was a major split up until the 1896 election, when the second industrial revolution and just mass production that happened in the United States very much changed the way that we viewed things. We kind of started to view things less in terms of the issue of race, in terms of national politics, and moved to taking a look at things in terms of economically. Democrats are still solidly in the South. The Republicans are still more in the North, but the issues are more over the issues of policy related to economics. And we get voting blocks, basically. They're the same as the third party system, with Republicans stronger than ever in the industrial North and winning support from all economic classes. Business interests dominated most of this period, but the progressive movement rose in response, demanding reforms. That's more in the Democratic Party. Republican Party is more the party of business at this point. Then there's another major shift that happens here as a result of the Great Depression. That's the major organizing event that defined the fifth party system, which is from 1932 up until 1968, when race becomes an issue again and thus further splits the parties. So the Great Depression actually basically said that all these Republican presidents just doesn't work anymore, because their view of putting business interests first led to some of the unregulated mess that created the Great Depression in the first place. And the Democrats formed what they call a New Deal. New Deal meaning like just a whole new idea about things. There's a major part of American history we'll talk about the New Deal, in part because FDR is president for so long. And the Democrats are still in the South, and the Republicans are still mostly in the North. But the big issue is that the Democratic Party is now saying we're going to take these progressive era reforms, and we're actually going to go further and believe that there is a need for the government to provide assistance to those that are in most need. And it gets the creation of all these New Deal programs. Famous among them are things like Social Security, and then later on during LBJ's presidents, Medicare and Medicaid. So these big social welfare programs as being a major solution, as opposed to the Republican point of view, which was that unregulated businesses are probably better for the economy, where the market can determine things. So then there's this final shift, and this is basically the Democratic Party remains like more of the New Deal party, except it's now finding that the people that were in that Democratic Party that were segregationists, even prior to 68, split. When the Democratic president of the United States signs the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, that kind of split the southern part of the Democratic Party in half, and basically created the system that we have today, which is where the Democrats are majority in the North and the Republicans are majority in the South. So Democrats who were maybe pro New Deal policies, or just within that party for so long, that were in the South, sometimes referred to as Dixiecrats because they're from the South, left the Democratic Party and went into the Republican Party. And the Republican Party kind of morphed into this new thing that was divided at that point along the issues of race. Historians have actually disagreed as to whether or not this fifth party system is entirely over. We'll have to reckon with the elections that have happened since this period. Since 2016 was an important election that maybe historians will look at and see there's a new party shift taking place. That's maybe the seventh party system. Also, the 2020 election may also inform that as well. But it basically happened in 1968, was where that major shift takes place, when Nixon wins the White House. Others point to Reagan in 1980 as being this conservative shift as to when it takes place. Certainly by 1994, Republicans swept the majorities in both houses. The parties had majorly shifted by that point. So Republicans now dominate national elections in the South and maintain West, while Democrats win the Northeast and other urban areas. They're more divided ever since the Civil War. Republicans support strong national defense, low taxes, small government, prefer state power over federal power. Democrats support a strong and active national government and are more likely to support social programs and progressive income tax to pay for them. So to say that the Democratic Party is like coming from the Democratic Republicans, I mean, the Democratic Republicans didn't believe in that. They thought that the best government is the one that was governing least and the one that was closest to the people. Now the Democratic Party in this party system is saying that big government is actually a way to solve some of the many problems of society. So that's really different. And the Republican Party wasn't even around during the first party system. So it's not true that you could like draw this direct line. And if you want to see some of the big overview of all of this, just kind of look back at the colors, and you'll see like where things kind of shift. This is kind of all a mess because we're not really organized into neat, distinct political parties for a long time. It's kind of all over the place. Um, but by the time of the 20th century, which is down here, things seem to be settled out. Yes, there are third party movements, but not nearly as fractious as they were here. That doesn't mean that the country is knitted together and has unity here. It just means that there was more diversity of opinion and thought at the national level. So every time we go into a different unit, a different part of the course, my strong suggestion is for you to kind of study the chart, read the call outs, take a look at what the issues are and all the colors, and zoom in and zoom out and kind of get a sense of what's going on in American political party history. Because I think it will also help you kind of understand what's generally going on in that moment. But the big takeaway is, look, it isn't this direct through line. It's far messier than to say that the Democratic Republican Party leads to the Democratic Party of today. I don't agree with that. Or that the Federalists Party of that time period is the same as the Republican Party. It doesn't quite work that way. It's much more complex than that. And if you can kind of see these things in periods and what caused those shifts, I think you'll have a nice understanding of how political parties have worked in American history.